A strange wail echoed across the skies of European sound that once froze soldiers in terror. It was the scream of the Stuka's Jericho trumpet, that siren of doom that roared down with every dive. When those horns began to shriek, men knew death was seconds away. But by 1943, that sound no longer terrified anyone, because a new thunder had cometh a roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Germans called it the Jug. The Americans called it a beast. With its massive engine, thick armor, and 8 heavy machine guns, it wasn't just a fighter, it was a flying hammer built to smash the Luftwaffe's old gods out of the sky. The Stuka, once the symbol of German dominance, was suddenly the hunted, and this duel between the screaming dive bomber and the thundering fighter became one of the most ironic reversals of the Second World War. Because the Stuka had once ruled the battlefield through fear, the P-47 ruled it through sheer, unrelenting power. But this isn't just about aircraft. It's a story of two doctrine zones born from precision and terror, the other from brute survival and overwhelming firepower. A story of how technology, pride, and timing collided in the skies above Europe and changed air warfare forever. Long before the P-47 roared into service, the Luftwaffe had already built its Legenda machine, so feared it seemed supernatural. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, short for Sturzkampfflugzeug, or dive bomber, was designed not just to drop bombs, but to break morale. It didn't glide gently toward its target. It screamed at it. When the Stuka dived, its fixed undercarriage and sirens turned gravity into theater. Pilots would point the nose straight down, sometimes at 80 degrees, aiming their bombs with terrifying accuracy. And when they pulled up, automatic systems saved them from blacking out. In the early campaigns, Poland, Norway, France, the Stuka looked unstoppable. Its howling dives preceded the fall of every major city. Bridges collapsed, convoys scattered, and columns of civilians fled as the trumpet of death descended. German propaganda turned the Stuka into a divine weapon. Newspapers called it the Angel of Annihilation. Even Allied soldiers whispered its name with unease. One British private later recalled, "You didn't hear the bomb first. You heard that scream. Then you realized it was coming for you." But the myth was built on one fragile truth. The Stuka could only thrive when it owned the sky. Its design so perfect for the Blitzkrieg, an ugly flaw. The same fixed landing gear and dive brakes that made it stable also made it slow, painfully slow. At high altitude, a Spitfire or Hurricane could catch it easily. And when the Battle of Britain began, that's exactly what happened. On August 18th, 1940, known as the Hardest Day, the Luftwaffe sent over 100 Stukas to attack British radar and airfields. The RAF met them head-on. 39 Stukas went down in a single day. After that, Goering quietly pulled them from the front. The Stuka's invincibility had been a Lear weapon of terror that depended on others to survive. But inside the Luftwaffe, not everyone wanted to let it die. Some pilots, obsessed with precision bombing, believed the Stuka was still essential. Others whispered that the aircraft's designer, Hermann Pohlmann, had built something too specialized for a changing war. Rumors spread of Stuka pilots disabling their automatic pull-out systems, trying to regain control, even at the cost of their lives. One German ace joked darkly, "We dive to victory or to the grave." Yet, even as the Stuka's myth began to fade, German doctrine clung to it. The Luftwaffe still believed in the diving, that psychological edge, in the myth that precision and terror could substitute for air superiority. And that faith would soon meet its destroyer. Because while the Stuka had been born in an age of offense, the Blitzkrieg, the P-47, would emerge from an age of defense turned dominance. When the P-47 first rolled out of the Republic Aviation Factory in 1940, even some American pilots laughed. It was huge, a monster. Compared to the sleek Spitfire or the agile Zero, it looked like a flying oil drum with wings, but that size was its secret. Inside its round fuselage was the most powerful engine ever fitted to a single-seat fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower, 8-cylinder beast that could drag this metal brick through the sky at over 400 miles per hour. And thanks to a massive turbo supercharger tucked in its belly, the Jug could maintain that speed even above 25,000 feet. It was built like a tank and fought like one. Where other fighters were sleek and fragile, the P-47 was unapologetically brutal. It could take a direct hit from flak, limp home with half its rudder gone, and still land in one piece. Stories spread of Thunderbolts coming back with holes big enough to crawl through the pilot, just grinning inside that thick armor bubble. But raw muscle wasn't enough. To become the Stuka killer, the P-47 needed teeth, and it had them. 8 Browning 5.0 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of spitting over 7,000 rounds per minute. Each burst tore through steel, armor, and airframes like lightning. The combined weight of fire was unmatched. When those guns opened up, the sky looked like a glowing wall of tracers. And the Thunderbolt could carry bombs up to 2,500 pounds of them. Later models even strapped on rockets, turning the P-47 into a hybrid fighter, bomber, and executioner in one. But perhaps its greatest advantage was not speed or firepower, it was endurance. With drop tanks, the Jug could fly over 800 miles. That meant it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel left to hunt. By the summer of 1943, when P-47 seconds began arriving in Britain, Allied pilots were desperate for something that could challenge the Luftwaffe's fighters and strike their ground forces. The Thunderbolt was the answer, even if few understood just how deadly it would become. At first, it wasn't perfect. The early P-47B had a razorback canopy that limited visibility. It climbed slower than the sleek German Bf-109. Pilots called it stubborn in turns, like wrestling a bull. But at high altitude, nothing could catch it. Then, in late 1943, the improved P-47D arrived with a bubble canopy and better roll rate. It was faster, deadlier, and tougher. By then, pilots had learned to use its brute force strategically. They didn't dance with the enemy, they struck like hammers from above. That's when the real nightmare began for German dive bombers. Because the Stuka's entire existence relied on predictable flight paths, slow climbs, steep dives, fixed exits. Against nimble RAF interceptors, that was already a problem. Against the P-47's speed and firepower, it became suicide. The Jug could spot a diving Stuka miles away, throttle down, dive after it, and shred it mid-pull-out before it could escape. And the irony? The same air resistance that made the Stuka stable in a dive made it impossible to flee. German pilots soon learned that the moment they heard a P-47's guns behind the mitt was already too late. By 1944, Thunderbolts were flying daily across occupied Europe, waiting for Stukas to appear. But the Luftwaffe, still clinging to its old doctrines, kept sending them. The result was a massacre. But the story wasn't just about aircraft meeting in the sky. It was about how two nations with entirely different philosophies of war-built machines that reflected their souls. Germany built the Stuka to terrify and control. America built the P-47 to endure and destroy, and when they finally collided, the sky itself seemed to change sides. The first time a P-47 pilot locked eyes on a Stuka, he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. The enemy aircraft looked like something from another, war-straight, spindly landing gear fixed in place, wings squared off like a relic. From 1939, and yet, there it was, lumbering in the sky above occupied France, diving in that classic near-vertical plunge that had once terrified armies. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had redeployed Ju-87 units to the Eastern Front, North Africa, and later to Italy. But in every theatre where they appeared, Allied fighters were waiting faster, heavier, and utterly unforgiving. The P-47 was new to the European theatre, but it was already rewriting air combat. In April of that year, pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, began their sweeps over occupied Europe. Their mission was simple: clear the skies for bombers and attack anything with black crosses on its wings. The first clashes with Stukas were almost unfair. The Ju-87 seconds, built for precision bombing at low altitude, were never meant to dogfight. Their defensive gunner, armed with a single 7.92mm MG-15, could do little against 50 calories, Brownings, tearing through its fuselage. One P-47 pilot described it like hunting ducks with a thunderstorm behind him. The Stukas would appear below, lining up for an attack, and the jugs would roll over from altitude, engines screaming, diving at over 400 miles per hour. By the time the Stuka pilot even knew he was being targeted, tracers were already shredding his tail. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They began flying Stukas in tighter formations, each covered by full 190 escorts. But even that had limits. The Thunderbolts could simply choose when to strike, using altitude and speed as weapons. And once a P-47 began its dive, even a 190 struggled to intercept before the jug had fired and climbed away. The Battle of Salerno in September 1943 marked one of the last significant appearances of Stukas against American troops in the West. They swooped in to attack landing craft and tanks on the beaches just as they had done years earlier in France. But this time, the roar of the Jericho trumpet was met by a louder, angrier sound, the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines descending from the clouds. P-47 seconds from the 325th Fighter Group tore through the dive bombers, catching them as they tried to pull out. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning wreckage. The Stukas that survived limped home, riddled with holes, their rear gunners dead or wounded. Reports from that day describe American pilots feeling a mix of triumph and disbelief. These were the planes that had once ruled the skies of Europeno, being shot down almost effortlessly. One pilot later said, "It wasn't a fight, it was an execution." But not every encounter went cleanly. The Stuka's dive angle made it difficult to intercept during the vertical plunge, itself some P-47 seconds overdived, losing control in the chase. The Germans learned to bait fighters by pretending to dive, then leveling off at treetop height, forcing the heavier P-47 seconds to overshoot. Occasionally, a Thunderbolt pilot who followed too close ended up pulling out too late, slamming into the ground or ripping his wings off, yet those were rare exceptions. By late 1943, the pattern was clear. The Stuka could only survive in narrow conditions: clear weather, heavy escort, and limited exposure. Even then, they were prey the moment the P-47 seconds arrived. One of the few surviving Ju-87 gunners recalled it grimly. "When we saw the silver planes with the white stars, we knew we were finished. Their guns cut through us like lightning. Our only chance was to dive and hope they missed, but they never missed." The Luftwaffe tried one last evolution, the Stuka G variant, armed with two massive 37mm cannons under its wings, designed to destroy tanks. It could shred armor, but at a cost. The added weight slowed it even more, turning it into a sitting target. Against Soviet and American fighters alike, it was suicide. The age of the dive bomber was ending, and the age of the fighter bomber had begun. But the real turning point wasn't just in technology, it was doctrine. The way both sides thought about air power itself was changing, and in that shift, the P-47 found its destiny. By 1944, the skies over Europe had changed forever. What began as a war of daring raids and pinpoint strikes had evolved into a brutal contest for air supremacy. The Luftwaffe's precision doctrine built around aircraft, like the Stukawas, collapsing under the weight of its own limits. The Americans, led by squadrons of P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds, now fought with a new philosophy: own the sky first, destroy everything beneath it second. The Stuka had been born from a tactical dream, the vision of total coordination between air and ground. It wasn't meant to fight for the air, it was meant to dominate the battlefield below it. But that dream depended on something the Germans could no longer guarantee: protection. In 1940, the Stuka had always been accompanied by Messerschmitts. By 1944, those fighters were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Allied bombing campaign sustained by P-47 escorts was cutting deep into Germany's heart. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and broken logistics turned the Luftwaffe from hunter to hunted. Meanwhile, the Americans had discovered something the Germans never fully embraced: flexibility. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed for any single mission, and that's what made it so deadly. When bomber escorts were needed, it climbed high. When tanks needed to be destroyed, it dove low. It could strafe, bomb, or intercept, and do all three in a single sortie. This adaptability marked a revolution in air warfare. The age of specialized aircraft, the pure dive bomber, the pure interceptor, was dying. The P-47 was the proof. In early 1944, Allied commanders launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. Hundreds of P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds escorted bombers deep into Germany, smashing aircraft factories, fuel depots, and training fields. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the air, including Ju-87 units pressed into emergency ground attack roles. It was a massacre. Stukas, now slower and heavier than ever, were easy pickings for the high-speed escorts. One pilot from the 56th Fighter Group recalled, "We'd catch them circling over a column or a bridge, and by the time they rolled out of their dive, we were right behind them. They never even saw us coming." The Luftwaffe began rethinking its faith in dive bombing entirely. Discussions inside the German Air Ministry turned bitter. General Wolfram von Richthofen, once the great advocate of dive bombing, now called the Ju-87 obsolete beyond hope. Others tried to defend it, arguing that in the East, where the Soviets lacked modern fighters, the Stuka still had value. But even that was fading. The Red Air Force, now flying Yaks and La-5S, began tearing apart Stuka formations with brutal efficiency. And as the Ju-87 vanished from western skies, the Germans scrambled to replace it. The Focke-Wulf 190F series took over the ground attack role, armed with rockets and bombs, a direct imitation of what the Americans were already doing with the P-47. It was an ironic reversal. The Luftwaffe had inspired the world with the Stuka's terrifying precision at the start of the war. But by its end, they were copying the enemy's fighter bomber model just to survive. Doctrine had turned on its head. The Americans no longer feared low-altitude attacks. Now they were the ones delivering them, strafing convoys, rail lines, and armored columns with merciless firepower. Every P-47 pilot was taught that the mission didn't end once the sky was clear. If you had ammo left, you went hunting. Thunderbolt pilots joked grimly that the P-47 stood for Porker 47 dead Germans per mission. It wasn't far from the truth. The change in tactics was psychological as much as strategic. While the Stuka relied on terror to demoralize ground troops, the Thunderbolt relied on destruction. Its 8.50 cals didn't scream like the Jericho trumpet, but their sound was worse. A tearing, ripping roar that shook the earth. American infantrymen on the ground learned to cheer when they heard it. "Our jugs are here," they'd say. "It's over for the enemy now." And so the P-47 became what the Stuka once was, the symbol of dominance. But unlike the Stuka, its power didn't depend on the myth of invincibility. It depended on control, control of the air, control of doctrine, control of war itself. That control would soon manifest in brutal clarity in one of the most lopsided aerial massacres of the entire war. The spring of 1944 brought a new kind of war to the skies. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, yet the Germans still clung to fragments of their former doctrine. Stuka squadrons were ordered to keep flying, strafing Allied columns, striking bridges, ambushing tanks. But every sortie now carried a death sentence, because the thunderbolts were waiting. In the early morning haze over France and northern Italy, you could sometimes hear them before you saw them, the deep, throaty growl of R-2000, 800 engines echoing over the clouds. They patrolled in pairs, often above 20,000 feet, scanning for anything slow or foolish enough to show itself. Below, Stukas crawled over fields and valleys, heavy with bombs, their crews half-blind in the thick morning mist. When they met, the results were devastating. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, Ju-87 appeared for the last time on the Western Front. A few desperate squadrons tried to attack Allied landing ships off Normandy, but before they reached the beaches, they were intercepted. P-47 seconds from the 56th and 362nd Fighter Groups dove from altitude and tore through them. In less than 5 minutes, over a dozen Stukas were destroyed, some exploding mid-air as their bombs detonated. One pilot reported, "It was like watching glass shatter in the Sunday." There were similar scenes over the Italian campaign. In February, over the Anzio beachhead, Stukas appeared at dawn to hit Allied shipping. Thunderbolts from the 325th and 79th Fighter Groups were already circling. They pounced from above, firing long bursts that cut through the German formations like scythes through wheat. By the end of the day, only a handful of Stukas made it back to base. Their unit, Senk G-151, was effectively erased. Eyewitness accounts from Allied troops tell of burning wreckage falling like black rain. The distinctive whine of the Jericho trumpetons, the symbol of terror, was replaced by the deafening roar of machine gun fire and explosions. One infantryman later said, "You could tell who owned the sky just by the sound." The Stuka screamed, the jug thundered, and thunder always wins. Even in the east, where the Luftwaffe tried to keep the Ju-87 alive, the results were no better. Soviet Yak and La-5 fighters were now everywhere, and American Lend-Lease Thunderbolts flew alongside them in small numbers. When the Stukas tried to attack Red Army bridges near the Vistula River in late '44, they were ambushed mid-dive. Soviet reports noted that not a single enemy plane escaped without damage. The P-47's greatest advantage wasn't just speed, it was freedom. While the Stuka was bound to its slow, deliberate descent, the Thunderbolt owned 3 dimensions of combat. It could dive, climb, and roll at will. And when it came down firing, there was no safe angle for the enemy. The Stuka's rear gunner, the last line of defense, was helpless against the hailstorm of 50 calories rounds. Pilots began calling them one-pass kills. The jug would dive, fire, and climb away. The engagement was often over in seconds. One of the most chilling episodes came during the retreat from Normandy in August 1944. Luftwaffe commanders, desperate to stop advancing Allied armor, threw a mixed group of Ju-87 seconds and Fu 190 seconds against the breakout columns. They didn't make it halfway. P-47 seconds of the 362nd Fighter Group intercepted them over Falaise. Radio recordings from that day captured the brief exchange. "Blue 3, tally-ho, Stukas low, 10 o'clock. Roger, diving in. God Almighty, they're just sitting there. Splash 1, splash 2, they're going down like flies. In less than 10 minutes, 18 Ju 87 seconds were shot down. Not a single thunderbolt was lost. By autumn, the Luftwaffe finally accepted the inevitable. The Stuka squadrons were disbanded or reassigned to anti-tank duties on the Eastern Front. The once glorious dive bomber, the symbol of the Blitzkrieg, was now a relic useful only in isolated pockets where no Allied fighters roamed. And that was the ultimate irony. The weapon that had once terrified Europe now depended entirely on hiding from the very skies it once ruled. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Stuka. In combat it erased its reason for existing. No longer did armies need to rely on slow, precision dive bombers. With Thunderbolts and Mustangs carrying bombs and rockets, any fighter could now strike from above, fast and hard, without warning. The very idea of dive bombing the proud German art of controlled descent was dead. Yet, in that death, a new philosophy of air power was born. Because the P-47 proved something profound, that brute force, adaptability, and speed could achieve what precision and fear once promised. And that realization would reshape every air force in the decades to come. When the war ended in 1945, the skies over Europe were silent again, but they carried ghosts. Wrecked Stukas lay half-buried in the mud of France and Poland, their once screaming sirens now twisted metal. Nearby, Thunderbolts stood parked on airfields, streaked with oil, their fuselages pitted from flak and grit. The duel between the P-47 and the Ju 87 had lasted barely a year, but its legacy stretched far beyond that. It wasn't just a clash of aircraft, it was the death of an idea. The myth of the Stuka precision dive bomber, the terror of Blitzkrieg, had been built on propaganda as much as on performance. Early in the war, Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda filmed Ju 87 seconds diving in slow motion, their bombs hitting perfectly timed explosions on the ground. The footage was shown across Europe. Soldiers believed the Stuka was invincible, but the truth, revealed after the war, was far less glorious. In official Luftwaffe records, the Ju 87 had one of the highest loss ratios of any aircraft type ever built. Of roughly 6,500 Stukas produced, nearly 6,000 were lost in combat or destroyed on the ground. By the last year of the war, their average survival time in active operations was measured in days. The P-47, by contrast, became a legend not just for its victories but for its survival rate. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built, and though thousands were shot down, the aircraft's toughness became folklore. Pilots who crash-landed often walked away. One squadron joked that a jug doesn't crash, it just lands somewhere else. But the statistics tell only part of the story. What really mattered was what those numbers meant to the men who flew them. For Stuka crews, every mission after 1943 was a death march. The Luftwaffe could no longer provide escorts, and Allied radar picked up every sortie. They were brave suicidally so. Ju 87 pilots dove through curtains of flak and cannon fire, still trying to hit bridges or convoys that no longer mattered strategically. Their courage was never in doubt, but courage cannot defeat evolution. For Thunderbolt pilots, victory came with a strange sense of disbelief. The men who grew up fearing the Stuka's scream were now swatting it out of the sky. Many found no joy in it, only inevitability. They respected their enemies, even as they destroyed them. One pilot of the 78th Fighter Group wrote in his diary after downing 2 Stukas over France, "They never even turned. I almost wished they had. I didn't want it to be that easy." Yet the myth persisted. In the post-war years, the Ju 87's haunting, siren and dramatic shape made it famous in films and documentaries. To the public, it remained the face of the Luftwaffe. To historians, it became a symbol of arrogance, a weapon, so terrifying in concept, yet so fragile in practice. The P-47, meanwhile, never got the same romantic fame as the Mustang or Spitfire. It was too big, too ugly, too practical. But to those who understood Warto, the ground troops who watched it, saved them day after day, it was a godsend. The Jug didn't need beauty or glamour, it had results. In the years that followed, air doctrines around the world quietly shifted. No major air force ever built another dedicated dive bomber. The concept was dead. The future belonged to aircraft that could do everything, fighters that could strike, bomb, and survive. The legacy of the P-47 lived on in that new generation. The F-84 Thunderjet, the F-100 Super Sabre, and ultimately the multi-role jets that dominate today. But even now, the duel between the Stuka and the Thunderbolt remains a study in contrasts of terror versus strength, precision versus power, past versus future. Historians still debate the finer details. Many Ju-87 seconds were actually downed by Thunderbolts, how many by Spitfires or Flak. Some claim the records were inflated by overzealous pilots or misattributed kills. Others argue it doesn't matter. What matters is what the duel represented. The Stuka was the old worlder weapon of spectacle, built on the illusion of invincibility. The Thunderbolt was the new world, loud, ugly, efficient, and unstoppable. And in the cold logic of war, efficiency always wins. When the last Stuka fell silent, an era ended. The war had begun with screaming dives and clean precision. It ended with thunder-heavy, relentless, unapologetic. The Ju-87 had been born in a world that still believed in the romance of battle, where victory came from daring and precision, where courage alone could shape destiny. But by the time the P-47 filled the skies, that world was gone. Modern war no longer rewarded beauty or bravery, only power, adaptability, and endurance. The Thunderbolt didn't just kill a plane, it killed a philosophy. The Stuka represented the old faith that man could dominate chaos through discipline and accuracy, that war could be controlled through willpower and planning. The P-47 proved that war was far too vast, far too violent for that. The battlefield had outgrown the myth. In the space of 5 years, the Stuka went from predator to prey, from the symbol of blitzkrieg to the symbol of obsolescence. And the P-47, that ungainly brute of metal and fire, became the unlikely heir of air supremacy. When you look back at those black and white photos, the Stuka diving over Poland, the Thunderbolt roaring over Normandy, you see more than airplanes. You see the turning of an age. The wail of the Jericho trumpet was the sound of fear. The roar of the Thunderbolt was the sound of dominance. And somewhere between those two sounds, the entire nature of air warfare changed. Because in the end, the P-47 didn't just win the duel, it rewrote the rulebook. The age of terror had given way to the age of control, and the Scions ruled by precision would never again be the same.